You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of St. Paul's Letters to America. Excuse me, I'm your host, Ray Gerard, and today we're going to be talking about purges, specifically a purge currently being conducted in the United States. And for this, we're going to consider, well, first let's explain, what we're talking about by purges. It seems as if nowadays everything is subject to being torn down. Statues, images, symbols, holidays. We're trying to erase things, we're trying to sanitize things. Why is that, and is that good or is that bad? Well, we've got several examples of that to discuss today. But before we do, we're going to be talking about a letter from St. Paul, because after all, this is St. Paul's Letters to America. This is a program that asks, hey, what if St. Paul were alive today? What if he were actually here in America and he was around to actually write a letter to us in America? If he saw what was going on in our country, what would he want to tell us? What would he think we need to know, need to understand? Well, we think we know, and we're going to give you precisely that sort of a letter, which will be perfectly applicable to America here today. If he were here, he would write us this letter. How can we be so sure? Well, it's really pretty simple. The things he wrote do not change over time. In any place, with any people, in any era, they are the same. The truths are the same. The principles are the same. The admonitions are the same. Because there is one God, one Christ who is all and in all. And so we say that if he were here, he would write a letter to us. Oh, and by the way, I think it's important for this particular program, as it is for all of them, to repeat our motto, which is love and kindness through the light of truth. It is always important to bear in mind the truth. We can never shrink from the truth. If we shrink from the truth, then we will be lost. But we can always do that with love and kindness. Some people would have us think, if you're going to be totally loving and kind, you cannot say things that will upset anybody. But what if the truth upsets people? Are we not allowed to say it then either? Matter of fact, one of our examples today will highlight that very clearly. And it is not to be debated. It could be debated. I'd debate anybody on it. That you could always be loving and kind, but still maintain the light of truth. The two are not mutually exclusive. Matter of fact, the two are usually very inclusive. But any of it. The letter St. Paul would write to America, his letter to Americans today. If then you were raised with Christ, seek what is above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Think of what is above, not of what is on earth. Slaves, obey your human masters in everything, not only when being watched as currying favor, but in simplicity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, do from the heart, as for the Lord and not for others. Masters, act in the same way toward them and stop bullying, knowing that both they and you have a master in heaven, and that with him there is no partiality. Now, what should we take out of this particular letter? Well, St. Paul is talking about slaves. Now, a lot of the purging that we are being encouraged to engage in this country today has to do with erasing all symbols that can in any way be characterized as racist, that is offensive to other people if there is even the slightest reminder of the historical past this country has had with racism. And surely that historical past is a disturbing, is a troubled time in our history. But what about the old maxim that says those who forget the past are destined, are obligated to repeat it? It is an important lesson. It is why we study history. It is why it's always important to study history. And in our country today, a lot of history is being forgotten. Schools no longer teach the way they used to, if they do at all, anymore about the founding of this country. We don't teach about Jefferson and Washington. In fact, a lot of people are now calling for statues of Washington and Jefferson to come down. They want Mount Rushmore. I don't know why that should be so difficult. Mount Rushmore to be erased or no longer declared a national monument. I don't know what exactly, but they have a problem with Mount Rushmore, which features Lincoln and Washington, and they want Lincoln gone as well. Of course, he freed the slaves, but they have a problem with him as well. Why is all of that happening? And if we no longer teach about Washington and Jefferson because they owned slaves and it may disturb, or the fact that they own slaves may be disturbing to people, and they shouldn't be held up as heroes, so we don't teach about them. We don't learn about the founding of this country. We don't learn why this country was founded. We don't learn why it was necessary to revolt from England so that we could have freedom, so that everybody could have freedom. That's why the Bill of Rights enshrines freedom of religion, which is now coming under attack, which is something else we'll also discuss today. Freedom of speech, which is coming under attack, and we will discuss today. And so, even with these things already being destroyed, because of the rights that people have to freedom of speech, we're going to be doomed to, repeat, the deficient, the defective, the broken lessons and examples and experiences of other cultures. There's a reason why this country has been strong for 200 years. There's a reason why it rose to be the strongest in the world. There's a reason why, for generations, people have wanted to come to our shores, and they still do. It's because of freedom. And what we have today, what we're being asked to engage in, is a definite and clear threat to freedom. And it's a threat to freedom given to us by God. St. Paul said that slaves should be obedient to your masters, but keep in mind God. Keep your eyes fixed on heaven. The letter that we started the program with was actually a mixture of some passages that he wrote in a letter to the Colossians and a letter to the Ephesians. But in the letter to the Colossians, the one letter contained basically another phrasing of the same principle that we borrowed from Ephesians. So the ideas that we quoted today go very much hand in hand. So he said, keep your eyes on heaven and then be obedient to your masters. How do those two go together? Because of what he said. When you obey masters, do it as if you are obeying God. Do not cause trouble. Do not revolt against the masters. It is obedience to God. I mean, it's a recognition that somehow God put these people in the places that they're in, or that your life, the situation of your life, is as it is because of factors higher than you, and they need not to be resented. They need not to be rejected or despised. Just accepted with peace. Then there will be no fighting among people. What we got today is a lot more fighting, encouragement for more and more fighting. But St. Paul said, be obedient. Be obedient. Because why? Because if you keep your eyes on heaven instead of on earth, the things on earth don't matter. They don't matter near as much as the things in heaven. And that's why you can be obedient to your masters. If it doesn't matter, if you're doing work, for hire, or if you work for yourself, you're just working. It doesn't matter in comparison to the things in heaven. And by the way, it's an interesting little historical fact, but the slaves that St. Paul was talking about were really debt slaves. it was a common feature in Israeli culture at the time for people to be slaves of other Jews. Jews would be slaves of Jews. It's not one people being enslaved to another. It was their own people, people of a single race being enslaved to other people of that same race. How did that happen? Well, everybody got a certain, piece of land, but sometimes people would need to borrow against the land. If they couldn't pay the loan, they went into debt, the land got foreclosed on. When that happened, they still had to work the land, but now they had to do it for the person who foreclosed on them. They became debt slaves. And if they married or had children, those family members would also become property of the masters. Now, there's a feature of Jewish law that slaves would be freed after 7 years. But most slaves, because they really didn't have much choice, or at least in many occasions, I don't know if I can say most, but in many occasions, these debt slaves chose to remain slaves. And so they continued in the servitude past the 7 years. There's a book by Deacon Bob Evans called Walking the Parables of Jesus, which he explains all of this in a parable on the lender, which occurs in chapter 7 of his book. And the parable of the lender is an interesting parable. In it, Jesus is invited to dinner. This occurs in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 7, and Jesus is invited to dinner by a Pharisee. But what happens is a sinful woman then realizes that he's in the house of this Pharisee, and she comes there, and she brings an alabaster flask of ointment. She stands behind him at his feet weeping, and began to bathe his feet with her tears. And then she anoints him. She wipes her feet with her hair and kissed them and anointed them with ointment. When the Pharisee saw this, he thought to himself, according to the gospel, if this man were a prophet, he would know who and what sort of woman that is who is touching him, that she is a sinner. And Jesus, knowing what the man said, or thought, said to him in reply, Simon, I have something to say to you. Tell me, teacher, he said. He said, 2 people were in debt to a certain creditor. One owed 500 days' wages, and the other owed 50. Since they were unable to repay the debt, he forgave it for both. Which of them will love him more? The Pharisee replied, well, in all likelihood, the one who had the bigger debt that was forgiven, the one who had more forgiven. And Jesus told him that he had judged rightly. And he talked about the woman. He said, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven. Hence, she has shown great love. But the one to whom little is forgiven loves little. He then said to the woman, your sins are forgiven. Apparently, because he said her many sins have been forgiven. Hence, there's a prior event, Deacon Evans writes, there's a prior event that probably occurred, and this woman wanted to show some gratitude. That's why she came to the Pharisee's house to find Jesus, which seems very likely. And so she loved more. It's because of some kindness Jesus had already extended to her, knowing that she was a sinful woman, but because he extended some kindness which she wanted to repay, he had, in effect, already forgiven her. He didn't disown her. He didn't push her away. He didn't shun her. And that's why she came in gratitude. She loved more because she had received more. Now, isn't that an interesting lesson for our country here today? What we're teaching people is to love less and expecting us to instead love more. The exact opposite recipe from what we need. Anyways, this is the parable that Jesus talks about, and it's about debtors and lenders and forgiveness. And Deacon Evan writes that the meaning of the parable obviously is that we need to forgive. We need to live in peace with others. And because St. Paul writes that masters need to be need to be kind to their slaves, but slaves need to be obedient to their masters. He must be he must be insensitive as well. The That could be offensive. That could hurt somebody emotionally and psychologically. Just a reference to slavery, even though Jewish historical customs meant that these people were of the same race. Even though they were of the same race, it really doesn't matter. Any reference to slavery at all will do. We have people being, exercised and effectively erased from history in the minds of many because of any slight connection, with something that is improper. We're going to be talking about St. Louis in a second, and we'll see there how we need to sanitize people according to certain proponents of this new purge culture that we live in. We need to sanitize people. If there's even the slightest thing wrong with them, they got to go. We can't remember them. We can't even remember them. Well, if that's the standard, if that's the test, then we have to purge St. Paul. He references slavery as if it's a good thing. He's got to go. I mean, my goodness. If I didn't explain to you the historical culture of the time, would you feel any less sympathetic towards St. Paul? Surely you might. You might think, here's a guy who's endorsing slavery. I don't care if he's telling the masters to be obedient and be kind to the slaves. How demeaning is that? I mean, there's a statue of Abraham Lincoln that people are trying to get removed because there's a black slave kneeling as he's emancipating all the slaves. And that slave then is subordinate to him, seen in some kind of a subordinate light. Now, the reason Lincoln stood for abolitionism was because he thought all people are equal. But the way it's depicted is, the way it's artistically depicted is insensitive. So that's got to go. Well, certainly Paul then has to go by that same standard. We've got to get rid of St. Paul. We've got to get rid of St. Paul. He's a racist. He believes he believes in slavery. He's insensitive. How could he be good according to the new morals that we have, where everybody's supposed to be loving all the time? And in the name of love, we erase people from history. And we'll explain that as we talk about St. Louis. St. Paul would then have to go. So if we wipe out not just, what's next? If we take out statues, and someone's also already called, as we talked about on a prior program, for the removal of any depictions of Jesus if he happens to be portrayed as white. Now, a lot of people portray Jesus as a member of their own race. They depict him how they like to see him. And what's wrong with that? I've got no objections, and I don't know anybody else who would if you depict Jesus in another light, a different racial, kind of a picture. What does it matter? He's God. It doesn't matter if you have your eyes fixed on heaven. Would I deny somebody else the right to see Jesus as he wants to see Jesus? Where would I get that right? Where would I get the right? If Jesus gave everybody else freedom, if God gave everybody else freedom, how would I have that right to deny somebody else the use of their freedom as they see fit on that kind of a subject? When do we have the right to interfere with somebody else's freedom? Well, when they're going to hurt other people. Violence against other people, of course, that would be an occasion. But other than that, if the way they want to think, the way they want to believe, where would we ever get the right to try to tell people how they could think and how they could believe? This country was founded on something different, and this country is now experiencing something very different from that. So if St. Paul's got to go, then we've got to get rid of the writings of St. Paul. The writings of St. Paul. Not just statues, but writings. Maybe we'll have to burn books that contain the writings of St. Paul. Is that coming? Will that be next? Why wouldn't it? Other countries that have followed the socialist path have done exactly that. Just look at China today. Well, in any event, let's get on to some of our stories that are in the news lately. So let's go to St. Louis, because I'm recording this basically in St. Louis. It's where I live. And there, about a week ago, there was a big protest over a statue. There's a statue in downtown St. Louis of St. Louis. Strange. Isn't that funny? In any event, he's depicted as somebody who led crusades. He's objected to because he's somebody who led crusades. These are, religious, religious genocidal wars. Trying to kill Muslims en masse, and therefore it's racially and on a religious basis discriminatory and bigoted, and so he's wrong. And we can't have a statue that honors him because that was part of his past. Well, of course, the funny thing about St. Louis is that there were some other features of his life. For example, yes, there we go. So he gave to the poor. He founded hospitals. Oh, and he invited the poor to dine with him. Funny, we just talked about a parable where Jesus has been invited to dinner. And then a sinful woman who the Pharisee obviously did not approve of and would not have invited into his house comes there, and Jesus welcomes her. A sinful woman, by the way, is generally understood, and there are references in the Bible, from the culture of the times, to a sinful woman. It's generally understood that meant a prostitute. But Jesus accepted her. He welcomed her. And St. Louis has been ordained by the church as a saint. St. Louis invited the poor to dine with him, following the example of Jesus and accepting sinful and poor people, and not following the example of the Pharisee. Not only that, but he washed their feet, just like in the story. And not only that, he was also known to have even washed the sores of lepers. How many of us would do that? That's why he's regarded as a saint. That's why he's a good person. Should we not remember him? Should we not honor him? And oh, by the way, if you want to check out some real history, the fact of the matter is that the crusades that he led were a response to attacks by Muslims on Christian communities in the Holy Land, in which Christians were massacred in a genocidal or religious fashion. So there was bigotry on the other side. And so that means we can't honor any of the leaders of that Muslim community. So maybe we should go to those Muslim countries and tell them they shouldn't honor the Muslim leaders from that time either. Maybe we should sanitize everything, cleanse everything. Is this even possible? No, it's not possible. Why is it not possible? Because nobody is perfect. There hasn't been anybody but, or since the time of Jesus, that's been perfect. We're going about a task that we can never achieve. So what will be left? What will be left? What will be left is the state. The state with its ideals and morals and rules. And who will set up those morals and rules as to how we should behave? Well, the people that run the state. And they won't be perfect either. But because it'll be the morals and rules set down by the state, then they'll be assumed to be perfect. We'll have to follow them. Oh, you think this is perhaps a joke? You think this is perhaps far-fetched, unrealistic? Talk to somebody who's lived under communism. And that's what we're finding now. There is one accepted way, one answer for things, one accepted way. And if you disagree, you are put down. That is what is happening in America today. We're not keeping our eyes on heaven. If we were, we wouldn't mind what other people do. We would allow them their freedom because there's something more important. But we really don't believe anymore. Many of us don't. Many of us have our eyes fixed only on earth, and we have to control what's on earth. because there is no good, benevolent God that's going to make it all right in the end. St. Paul says, we're going to get repaid in the afterlife. And if you're a master and you're not kind to your slaves, you will get paid, because there is no partiality with God, as the letter we started the program with says. But we don't believe anymore. That's why we have to organize things here just the way we want them, because they're all important. If there is nothing after this, then what is this is all important, because it is all there is. This is socialism. This is socialism. And a lot of the leaders of what's happening in our country today, a lot of the leaders of the movement that is happening in our country today, talk about this. They talk about the fact that they want a revolution. They talk about socialism. We had a major presidential candidate in one of the two primary systems. One of the two major parties in this country had a major presidential candidate. Matter of fact, he ran second, basically, to the eventual winner of the one party's actual nominee, and he's an open socialist. So, in any event, in St. Louis, there's a statue, as they say, in downtown, and recently there was a clash. There was about 200 people that clashed for about 3 hours, and the police had to intervene. At least one man was doused with some kind of a pink liquid and punched and thrashed about. It was mostly people, but there were some violent skirmishes of a sort. We're not becoming more peaceful. We're not becoming more accepting. We're not honoring other people's freedom. We're becoming more divisive, less accepting, less tolerant, less forgiving. The message of the parable was to forgive. We are not learning that. We forgive nothing. Even if it's 800 years old, even if it's a saint who died 800 years ago, we do not forgive. And that's supposed to make us better. One of the protesters in this demonstration trying to get the St. Louis statue removed is a certain man. He said he's going to come down. That was a frequent chant. And there was this man, Umar Lee, one of the protest organizers, said of the statute, "This guy right here represents hate, and we're trying to create a city of love. We're trying to create a city where Black Lives Matter. We're trying to create a city," and he isn't black, by the way. "We're trying to create a city," but that's fine. I mean, of course it's fine. It's perfect. I mean, he's honoring everybody. "We're trying to create a city where there is no anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. None. None. It's all got to go." That's the reason why the statue has to come down. We want no Islamophobia or anti-Semitism or of any sort. None. Can't have any. And that's why the statue of some guy who died 800 years ago has to go. Even though I said he would do what many of us would never even think of doing, washing the sores of lepers. We can have nothing that disturbs us, only a sanitized world. Well, there will not be a world where we can remember any people as heroes. Nobody was satisfied with that test. We will have no human heroes. And that sanitized, robotic type world, mechanized world with mechanized thinking, what will be left? The state. The state. The monolithic, abstract, unreal. In some ways it'll be very real, but the perfect ideals that it represents, are supposed to represent, will be unreal. That monolithic state. Now, if you think that perhaps this is not correct, this doesn't, that's never going to go that far, that isn't what this is all about, that it's really in response to racism, it's still really in response to the killing, the murder of George Floyd. Statues of Ulysses S. Grant are being ridiculed and attacked. Theodore Roosevelt, Jefferson, Washington, all these people. Even the arch, in the article in St. Louis today, they said that even criticized is the city's most prestigious monument, the Gateway Arch. Why? Because it's a tribute to Western expansion, the gateway to the West. It glorifies the fact that our country moved west, and America, conquered the continent. That's the problem. A tribute to Western expansion, a.k.a. American Indian annihilation and displacement. The arch now is a symbol of the exploitation of the American Indian, and therefore the arch has got to go. Maybe we'll have to just tear it down. What will be left? There's a columnist wrote in the Washington Post who said, there's an obvious difference between George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, who founded our Union, and say Jefferson Davis and Stonewall Jackson, who tried to destroy it. But do differences even matter? I mean, you've got Washington and Jefferson, who founded our country. And then you've got the leaders of the South, the Confederate South, who tried to destroy our country and split it apart. There is an obvious difference. And as a nation, shouldn't we remember, can't we remember, people who were responsible for founding or keeping our nation together, like Abraham Lincoln, and kept it together so that the slavery, the bane of all, the bane of our prior history, the reason we've got all this unrest still today, they tried to destroy that, men like Lincoln and so forth. Are we not to remember them? Ulysses S. Grant is coming under fire, and he was the one who defeated the Southern armies, and he also clamped down on the KKK. If being an anti-slavery leader, if being an abolitionist doesn't count, what is this about? Is it really about racism? The opinion writer in the Washington Post said there are obvious differences, but the differences don't matter. Well, and he's right. Well, I don't know that he said the difference, but he said there's an obvious difference. I'm saying the differences don't matter. Because if you want to tear down the statues of both, people on one side and people on the other, Grant, Lincoln, and you tear down the Confederate flag from all kinds of places, and you do both, then you're being indiscriminate in what you tear down. Does it make any sense? Well, yes, because it is not about racism. Not anymore. It started out that way. It starts out with protest against the murder of George Floyd. It continues with a lot of people who object to actual racism. But when you start tearing down, when it morphs into attacks on statues of people like Lincoln and other people, and it becomes indiscriminate, it doesn't honor the distinctions and the differences, then it's no longer about its racist beginnings. It's about something else. It's about tearing down the country. It's about creating chaos. It's about creating anarchy. Why? As so many people have said, we got to burn it down. We got to tear it down. How very different from the letter of St. Paul. Don't worry. Don't be bothered. Have peace in your heart. Whatever you have to suffer, you suffer for God. Offer it up to God. Because you should be keeping your eyes on heaven. You need to believe that there is a heaven. Oh, doesn't that make a difference if you believe there's a heaven? So, we should probably move on. We're going to run out of time before we get to cover everything we want to cover. What's another little episode in the recent news? Well, seems there was a fellow down in Florida State University by the name of Denton, Jack Denton, and he was the president of the Student Senate, and he was just voted out by the Student Government Association, voted out overwhelmingly. Although that was the second vote. They held a first vote, and it didn't gain enough numbers in order to pass. But then after 2 days and a public commotion, the vote changed. What was this all about? Why was he ousted? Well, seems like There was a discussion on a student chat room, and I think it was for Christian or Catholic students. And they were discussing the recent, I think it was a shooting, but the recent killing of a man. He was not black, but he was transgender or gender nonconforming or something of that nature. He was a suspect in a fatal stabbing. So he was suspected of having killed somebody. I don't know the circumstances of the police shooting. The fellow's name was Tony McDade. I don't know the circumstances around the shooting by the police of this Tony McDade. But he was a suspect, as I say, in a fatal shooting. In any event, that's not really important for our discussion. It's important for a different discussion, but not this one. Anyways, there was a discussion going on about that shooting, and there were certain organizations that were supporting the people who were looking into, I guess, for some kind of investigation, perhaps, of the police shooting. And among those organizations who were protesting the shooting were Black Lives Matter, an organization called Retain the Block, and the ACLU. And people were told where they could send money to donate to these organizations to help, I guess, Tony McDade's family, or people who wanted to, have authorities look into, or, wanted to raise funds to help, pursue the cause of objecting to this police shooting. Anyways, Mr. Jack Denton wrote in the chat room that, quote, "The various funds on that list are fine causes, as I know." He actually says they're fine causes, as I know. But everyone should be aware that those organizations all advocate for things that are explicitly anti-Catholic. He was asked to elaborate, and he wrote that one defends transgenderism, another abortion, and that these are contrary to the Church's teaching. He further said, I think there was people who were responding to him, and he felt the need to respond further, explain further. And he said, look, I don't mean to anger anyone, but Catholics should know what you're supporting. If I stay silent while my brothers and sisters may be supporting an organization that promotes grave evils, I have sinned through my silence. I love you all, and I want us all to be aware of the truth. So he talks about these some of these organizations as fine causes, but he says, I love you all. But he says, look, I'm just telling you that the Catholic Church does not support some of these things that some of these organizations support. Not that these organizations might not do other things that are really good, but that they support certain things that are against the Church's teachings, and people need to know it. And he didn't tell people not to donate to these organizations. He just said you should be aware. If you want to send a donation anyway, after being made aware of it, and you decide to do it anyway, he's not saying not to. He may not do it himself, but he's not telling other people what to do. In any event, he was accused of hurting members of the LGBTQ community, both emotionally and physically, and that these comments made them feel unsafe. There was a vote of no confidence, which I say did not garner sufficient votes. But then there was a petition that was circulated online against this transphobic and racist behavior. And that garnered more than 7,600 signatures. Then there was another vote by the Student Government Association, and he was removed rather overwhelmingly. Now, Mr. Denton then engaged, or was approached, and was agreed to be assisted by the Alliance Defending Freedom. They are appealing his case to the university's Supreme Court to get his job back. They say that this violated the school's non-discrimination policy and Mr. Denton's First Amendment rights. In the name of non-discriminating, we are going to discriminate against Catholics. By the way, he has a successor, president of the Student Senate. His name is Ahmad Deraldik. There's been another petition circulated to remove him, too. And that's gained over 9,500 signatures, 2,000 more than the one against Mr. Denton. But there's no vote scheduled as yet to have anything decided upon with Mr. Geraldic. Why was there a petition against him? Well, he supposedly said in some social media posts, F Israel. Of course, he used the whole word. And he referred to a stupid Jew, and he compared the Israeli government to Nazi Germany's. Now, he couldn't perhaps get the university sued for this could perhaps get the university sued for viewpoint discrimination. Why would you fire one guy because he says things that are perceived, and they're just religious? He's just quoting. He's not even indicating his own personal opinion, but he's informing others of what is, in fact, Catholic teaching. That gets you fired. Somebody else is obviously expressed, that's all we're talking about, is these expressions, these chat room messages and tweets and such. Somebody else has said something perhaps equally, if not more, hurtful. It doesn't matter. That's viewpoint discrimination, though, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Denton, talking about his removal, he said it was ludicrous and blatantly unconstitutional. Well, anytime you judge people based on their viewpoints, certain viewpoints are accepted, certain ones are not. He's right, it is unconstitutional. But the greatest concern was that the Senate, he said, that the Student Senate gave in to the mob. Quote, it was quite scary to witness how this mob could influence all these senators in 2 days to just switch their vote, to remove me as president for being Catholic, he said. Another student was quoted as saying, he's, fearful, fearful for religious students. It used to be that it was conservative students who were subjected to lots of attacks and vitriol and ridicule, but now religious viewpoints are coming under fire. And why is that? Because the religious viewpoint, the Catholic viewpoint, includes keep your eyes fixed on heaven, not the state. That is not acceptable. There is one viewpoint that's accepted, and if you don't have it, it's not allowed. Where do we get the idea of freedom of speech? Where do we get it? It is from this idea that we're given freedom by God, and that other human beings created by God don't have the right to take freedom away from other human beings created by God. It's a humble approach. It's a recognition we're all equal before God. As St. Paul said, there is no partiality. We're forgetting God. We're forgetting the fact that there is no partiality. We will insist on one viewpoint and one viewpoint alone. And if not, you don't have the right one, we will discriminate against you. We'll treat you differently than others who do accept the one viewpoint. How can we know this is the case? Student magazine from Florida State called The Spire. And the author of this article talks about the fact that Mr. Denton, quote, made transphobic, racist, and anti-abortion comments. He made transphobic, and racist comments. And this is dehumanizing, according to the article. What is dehumanizing? What is more dehumanizing than taking God out of our lives? That's the most dehumanizing thing of all. I could talk a lot about that, but we don't have the time. But made transphobic and racist comments. Made them. What is the author saying? The author's already convicted him, already made the judgment. These are already condemned. So judgmentalism, number one. The article went on to say he is unfit to hold the office of Senate President. Interesting. In the original chat room series of postings, one person wrote, what's the difference between a so-called, quote, religious issue and a, quote, human rights issue? What's the difference between a religious and a human rights issue? I'm not sure human rights have any valid rational grounding outside of a religious context. Well, isn't that what we're talking about? Isn't that the entire issue? How can you divorce religion from human rights? How can you say religion has no place in a discussion on human rights unless you say religion doesn't matter? Unless you already say there is no God. If there is a God, it changes everything. It changes everything about how we answer these questions on human rights. If that is why we all can be equal, if we're all created by God. If you decide religion cannot be allowed into the discussion, you've already decided there is no place for God. Let's see. Yes, the article goes on. Denton's words are alarming for many reasons. Firstly, he interrupted a discussion on systemic racism and murder of black Americans by police officers. With his own fears of anti-Catholic discrimination, he interrupted a discussion. One discussion is more important than another. How dare you even interrupt? You are not allowed to bring other considerations in. If it doesn't follow the narrative, if it doesn't follow the path we want the discussion to go, how dare you interrupt? You don't have the right to interrupt. What's the message? Stay silent. Be quiet. Shut up. That's the message. Why? How can someone write that? How can someone write? These are young people. These are the people who are going to govern this country. We're in for troubled times if this is the views of most of our young people. You don't have the right to interrupt. Does that sound like someone who believes in freedom of speech? There is no freedom of speech in that world. Then the next argument. Discrimination experienced by American Catholics is not in any way comparable to the discrimination historically experienced by black Americans. Catholics were not enslaved for 2 centuries. True. But is it not worthy of any discussion at all? One type of discrimination can be talked about. If the other doesn't rise as high, you can't talk about it. In other words, stay quiet, be silent, shut up. Why can't we talk about all kinds of discrimination? Why can't we say, being enslaved and suffering the whippings, the lynchings, the horrors, the absolute horrors of American slavery in the South? Why can't we talk about that and also talk about other discrimination? Why is it only one? Why can't we say, one is worse than another, but there are both? Is that not more truthful? Putting aside for the moment whether one is in fact worse than the other, I don't even, I don't even want to, I haven't given, I haven't even, that's something we can't even begin to talk about right now. Certainly in a physical sense, that's true. Although a lot of people could bring up cases of Catholic persecution where there are all kinds of martyrs at different eras in history. But again, not going into that whole discussion. The point is, in this person's mind, it's not comparable. And even if that's true, in this person's judgments base, that means you can't talk about it. That's the point. Further, the article goes on. Dean Benton's characterization of support for the LGBTQ community, abortion, etc. He says none of these positions are inherently anti-Catholic. It is fully possible to be Catholic and support queer and trans folks and/or trans yourself, abortion, etc. Really, it's really so. It's fully possible to be Catholic and support abortion. Oh, by the way, the author is a self-proclaimed agnostic who was raised Methodist, not a Catholic. Now, if you're white, you really can't talk about black lives and black situations and the things that black people go through. There's no way you can understand it. But if you're not Catholic, you can. double standards. Differences do not matter. Only the narrative, only one point of view, and if you don't have it, you'll be treated differently and poorly. Then the author gives it all away. She said, like many, is it a she? I don't know who wrote the article. Two people, Emily Pacenti and Alana Felton. All right, sounds like two women. Like many, Denton is attempting to use his religious identification as a cover for bigotry and cannot be left off the hook. Translation, being Catholic equals being a bigot. Is there another interpretation? Religious identification as a cover for bigotry. These authors are telling us that if you identify as a Catholic, you're trying to stand behind religious freedoms, trying to stand behind religion as a defense for being a bigot. The fact that Catholic teaching doesn't allow it is a defense, but the principle itself is bigoted. So if that's the case, then the Catholic principles are bigoted. Logically, this follows in an inescapable fashion. If you are Catholic, you are a bigot. Do we really believe in freedom of speech anymore? Freedom of religion? Not hardly. Not hardly. Opposition, they continue, opposition to queerness and transgenderism is unacceptable. And so therefore, again, the inescapable interpretation is, if the Catholic Church teaches that this is not proper behavior, that there's sinfulness attendant to it, then that is unacceptable. So the Catholic beliefs are unacceptable. That is why we are seeing more and more attacks, and we're going to see more. If you think it's bad now, it's going to get worse. More attacks on religion, on freedom of religion. It is unacceptable. If you have a religious belief that does not coincide with what we think, that is unacceptable. It will not be allowed. One view and one view only. If you don't have it, we will discriminate against you. That's it. Oh, and by the way, if we're going to compare plights of certain people, how is abortion worse than any kind of racism that's experienced in this country today? How is it worse? If you're going to look at the numbers of black people shot by police, I think somebody did a study on it. It's somewhere around 10 or less. So I don't know. There's one study about 15 a year or something. I don't remember the particulars. But how about the millions of black children who are aborted every year? If you have a religious view, they're people. If you have a religious view that life begins at birth, they've been killed. They've been murdered. But if one does not compare it to the other, it's because you've already decided abortion. And a religious view to the contrary doesn't count. It's wrong. One view and one view only. If you don't have it, you will be discriminated against. You won't have equal rights to other people. Oh, the College Democrats at Florida State University came out with a statement also supporting the removal of Mr. Denton. And in it, they said that he did not live up to the principles of Florida State, which included freedom of speech and diversity. Talk about ironic. Lastly, we'll try to cover this quickly. San Francisco, the city attorney from San Francisco wrote a letter to the General Counsel for the Archdiocese of San Francisco, threatening a lawsuit against them. Why? Because they're not living up to the mandate by the health officer for the city. Cited as some of their egregious practices were masses where there were there were three examples. I think there was a total of 6 examples of problems that were cited One included a member of the public, an anonymous person, who complained because he saw a sign on the sidewalk talking about a public mass being resumed in accordance with the decision of the bishop. And another one, then they, in relation to that complaint and some others, they sent out investigators, government investigators sent out to spy on, investigate churches here in America. Interesting. Did you ever think we'd see the day? And there are three examples cited. In one, St. Mary of the Assumption, they held a mass indoors with 23 people. There was another mass where there were 25 people. 23 and 25 people. This is egregious. It will not be. And now it's getting the archdiocese in trouble with the city attorney who's promising to go after them. There's a priest, one of the churches that was cited for one of these violations, the pastor, Father Joseph Illo, talked about the fact that he sees 50 people crowd onto city buses outside his door several hundred times a day. And he says he sees groups of people, 20 people, Golden State Park, 4 blocks from my door, none of them, outdoors, none of them without masks. Hundreds gather at Costco for 99 every day. Restaurants and streets around my church, she says, lots of people, dozens of people eat without masks. The mayor addresses hundreds of people in a protest at City Hall, no masks. Why? Why is that a problem? Because the city is limiting churches to no indoor masses. You can live stream them, but you can only allow 12 people, nobody in attendance, 12 people performing the service. All of them have to wear masks, even the priest on the altar, according to the city attorney. Meanwhile, all these people crowded onto buses and protests at City Hall, no masks. And if you have an outdoor mass, by the way, you're limited to 12 people. Outdoors, 12 people. It doesn't matter if you have social distancing. It doesn't matter if everybody's wearing masks. Is that not discrimination? Why is this? Well, the reasons are simple. Religion doesn't count as much. It's more important to go to Costco than to go to Mass. It's more important to go to Costco than to go to Mass. We don't believe in God. We don't believe in eternity. We don't believe one is more important. Heck, if anything should be more important than anything else, it should be Mass and the sacraments. You can die tomorrow, but if you're in a state of grace and you've received the sacrament, you've received confession, what's more important than that? But that's not what our government is telling us. And that's not what they believe. It can't be. If they believed it, how could they do this? So, this is a time of purges. We are told that we need to purge things, and what you need to purge more and more will be your religious faith. That's why the letter that we wrote from St. Paul starts, if then you were raised with Christ, seek what is above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Think of what is above, not of what is on earth. I've been your host, Ray Gerard. This has been another edition of St. Paul's Letters to America. Hope you've enjoyed it. Hope it's presented something provocative to you, even slightly. And we hope you will join us again. And until the next time, God bless.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization, and don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.